Welcome, friends. You have come to the right place for breaking legal news on multiple fronts. And even as we sit here, Steve Vladeck, who you see below, is fielding more new news. So we're going to have all of it. We're going to explain it. We're going to go through it. And you're going to get the best analysis possible in real time for breaking news. So sit back, tell your friends, text your friends, email your friends, let them know. We are going to be talking about it all right now. Yes, Jen and Steve Vladeck are live, says the message. So thank you all for hopping on. And we'll recap as we go along so that people who are joining us a little bit late still get to keep up. Steve, there was an amazing development in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. For months, we have heard from this administration that they could not get this man back. They acknowledged he had been improperly, mistakenly sent to El Salvador, and they said up and down, no, you have to talk to El Salvador. We can't do anything. We can't facilitate this. They stalled. There were numerous statements. I believe that there were declarations as well. And yet, what did we learn today? He's coming back to the United States. What is your take on this somewhat stunning development?
I mean, I have a lot of feelings about this development. I guess the first thing to say is that I think this is really a remarkable development from the perspective of the government conceding error yet again. I think the second thing to say is that the government now has an awful lot of egg on its face for all of the times it said it could not and would not bring Abrego Garcia back. This clearly disproves both of those. Jen, the third thing I would say is I think this is why, judicial review is important. That like this is, but for all of the efforts to challenge the government's behavior in the federal district court in Greenbelt, Maryland, I don't, it's impossible to believe this would have happened. And then the fourth is, the indictment that they've unsealed in the federal district court in Nashville, has one serious charge in it arising out of a traffic stop in Tennessee. But, it's just an indictment. And so one of two things is true. Either the government will eventually be able to prove its case, or it won't. And either way, to me, that's the system working the way it should have, from the get-go. So that's, that was my reaction. But what about yours?
Well, thank you, Steve. For those just joining us, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is being returned to the United States, and we're discussing why we think this shocking development is so shocking and perhaps what brought it about. My reaction, Steve, was that a lot of people who have been representing the government have not been telling the truth in court. Now, that is serious stuff. Particularly at a time, many federal court judges have been questioning and warning the administration about not being truthful. We just saw Judge Boasberg say the same thing. I have to give credit to these declarations from the government, but I remind you guys, you better be telling the truth. We've heard that over and over and over again. This essentially says to us, they've been making it up, or the lawyers haven't been told the truth. This is really the worst kind of behavior for the federal government, whose lawyers are supposed to get the benefit of the doubt, and apparently they can get him back. What do you think kind of forced their hand finally? Was it that ruling by Boasberg? Was it the fear that others were going to step forward? What do you think finally triggered their capitulation?
I don't know. I mean, let me start there. And we may not know without some sort of inside reporting and leaking. Indictments, as you know, Jen, don't just sort of happen overnight. And so it's entirely possible that the effort to sort of shore up some kind of criminal charges in Nashville had been under works for some time, and they only just finally took care of it. It's possible that, there was some snag in actually getting him back from El Salvador, although not nearly as much of a snag as the government said. Whatever the reason, I think the real key here is just to go back and look at all of the things that DOJ lawyers said in court about what they couldn't do and wouldn't do, the obnoxious tweets from the White House, right, and from President Trump and and Stephen Miller, that he's never coming back. He's back, right? And I don't doubt for a minute that there will be a sustained effort on the right to say, look at you people who said, he was innocent, right? Well, he's charged with these serious offenses. So, maybe maybe a jury will find him guilty of this charge. Maybe it never goes to trial, but like, that's not the point. The point is like,
Right.
that's what should have happened all along. And, the amount of energy and capital that was spent in trying to sort of foreclose this day from happening, in retrospect, just looks awful and
Does.
embarrassing, and is a really powerful, I think, indictment of what the Trump administration has been doing in these cases.
Absolutely. And I want to raise a few things concerning that indictment. First, I want to stress what Steve just said. These are allegations. And it's very peculiar that if they knew about these allegations, we're only hearing about them now. As you say, indictments don't just appear overnight. This must have been underway for some time, as were the plans to return him. So that raises a lot of questions. You also have to raise a lot of questions about who these mysterious unnamed witnesses are. Are they people who are at CCOT? Are they people who are reliable? Third of all, the allegations are enormous about illegal smuggling from Texas, all sorts of highfalutin claims. And yet, when you look at the indictment, there are a bunch of allegations about a bunch of people in a car in Tennessee. So there's a gap there. But I think we make a mistake to look at that indictment and try to figure out whether it's real or not. I have faith in the American judicial system. That's what this has been about, that these people belong in the United States with full constitutional rights, with the at least security of knowing that if they are in prison, they're not going to be put in some hellish conditions in El Salvador and kept from their attorneys and their loved ones. So I have to say, this is an amazing capitulation, and we will have to wait and see what we learn. I am really rather stunned that after all of this, they finally backed down and said, okay, we give up. He's coming back. Now, although this news, and for our friends who are just joining us, we're talking about the shocking return, the magnificent return in some respects, if you believe in the rule of law, of Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the United States. But there's also other news going on, and this is coming from the Supreme Court. And you probably haven't heard this anywhere because it's literally come out within the last few minutes. Steve, what are we hearing from the Supreme Court?
Um, Nothing good. So, just in the last really 10 or 15 minutes, we've gotten two different rulings from the Supreme Court on two of the now 19 emergency applications that President Trump has filed, trying to sort of pause lower court rulings. And the court has sided with the Trump administration in both of these cases. So the first is the dispute over DOJ's access to Social Security data. A federal district court had basically put that on hold while it was litigated whether DOJ should have access to Social Security data. The Supreme Court has basically unfrozen that, and has restored whatever access DOJ had, in an unsigned and just about almost completely unexplained order. There is a very sharp dissenting opinion by Justice Jackson, which was joined by Justice Sotomayor. Justice Kagan also noted her dissent, although she did not join the Jackson opinion. And so that was about, 15 minutes ago. And then right as we were coming on, the court issued a second ruling, this one in the FOIA lawsuit that was brought by Crew, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, basically just seeking to figure out, like, hey, what is Doge and who's in charge of Doge? And, can we use FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, to get access to some information? We can learn this. Um, and a district judge in Washington had said yes. And the DC Circuit had denied a stay. And the Supreme Court has basically frozen that too. This time, the order has a little bit of explanation. Basically along the lines of the discovery order was overbroad and impacted the sensitive, intra-executive branch communications, and that it should be sort of narrowed on remand. So not saying there can't be any discovery, Jen, but just that this was too broad. There's publicly noted dissents from Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, but no opinions. And so we have, two pretty important Friday afternoon rulings from the Supreme Court, yet again granting at least some relief to the Trump administration, yet again without really telling us why.
And just to be clear, these are not on the merits of the case.
No.
These are allowing, in essence, the government to keep doing what it has been doing or to avoid responding in the case of the FOIA matter. And that is exactly what you have documented over the years and complained about. This is the docket. This is using the motion docket in a very unpublic, untransparent way to, in essence, decide cases without deciding them, without explaining them, without getting briefed in their entirety. And what the court does is they use this shadow docket, as you have named it, in order to, in essence, kind of give the administration a little push to send them ahead. What is the nature of the dissent that you mentioned? Is this what the dissenters raised? Is it the improper use of the shadow document or the shadow docket, or is it something else?
It's mostly the latter. So, this is Justice Jackson. Once again, this court dons its emergency responder gear, rushes to the scene, and uses its equitable power to fan the flames rather than extinguish them. So, Justice Jackson, I think, has really become the most consistent critic of how the court is basically abusing these unsigned, unexplained orders and the sort of what the court's supposed to be doing in this very, very limited, procedurally fraught context. And, she's been, I think, consistent in saying the government just can't meet at least what had traditionally been the standard for this kind of emergency relief. And here is the Supreme Court over and over again, granting that relief anyway. And so, there really is, Jen, this striking disconnect between what we're seeing the Supreme Court do in the sort of apex due process cases. So Abrego Garcia, which, is what prompted us to get on the call this afternoon. The Alien Enemies Act litigation, where we've seen the court actually go out of its way to carve out a meaningful judicial role to push back against the Trump administration, versus all of these other cases where, I think I'd have to go back and check my spreadsheet. I think this is now the 9th and 10th times that the court has granted at least some emergency relief to the Trump administration. And, it's problematic enough in the abstract. It's even worse, I think, that the court is providing such a paucity of explanation for why. Because, it's depriving us of the ability to decide if there are good reasons for this or if it's just, the court getting out of the way of an administration to which it's at least outwardly sympathetic.
And to be clear, emergency petitions of this nature are exceptionally rare. Until the last spate of them, how many were there, Steve?
Yeah, so historically, the court would get, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 of these a term, mostly in capital cases, Jen. That's really where the emergency docket used to be the most active. The data point that I know you like is during the Bush and Obama administrations, two very different two-term presidencies. The federal government went to the Supreme Court for this kind of emergency relief a total of 8 times in 16 years. So once every other year. It gives you a pretty good feel for how rare it was. Trump sort of blew that up in his first term. He went to the court for this kind of relief 41 times in 4 years. So that was like a 20-fold increase. But Jen, this is now 19 applications in 19 and a half weeks from the second Trump administration. So we've gone from once every other year to, a little under once a month to once a week. And I don't think that's good for the court wholly without regard to the outcomes in these cases. But I think we're also seeing, Jen, the court's not in a position to write a detailed, persuasive, explanation in almost any of these cases, which means you and I are sitting here trying to figure out how could the court actually have come to these conclusions, especially in the light of, Justice Jackson's dissent, at least in the Social Security case.
Why would the chief and why would, for example, Justice Kavanaugh, who is not out there in right wing land, go along with this? Why wouldn't they simply say on these emergency petitions, this is not the kind of thing that warrants an emergency petition? Go back to the district court, go back to the circuit court. Don't bother us until you've got, a judgment. Why are they indulging the Trump administration in this fashion? They could rule on the merits when it finally gets to them, but why this subterfuge? Why this kind of almost cloak and dagger? We're going to rule for you, but we're not going to say why.
So I don't know that it's subterfuge. I mean, I think it is inertia, where the court has historically not felt impelled to explain these kinds of rulings, and it just sort of continues to not feel that impulse. That's a mistake. It's a mistake I've criticized the court for a lot, but I think I don't know that it's malicious so much as it is sort of negligent. Um, I think two different things are going on. I think, one, we have a court that is incredibly sympathetic to the kinds of executive power claims that a lot of these cases are based on. I mean, the Doge cases are based on, the confidentiality of executive branch communications. They're based on sort of the ability of the executive branch to decide who's going to have access within the executive branch. Like, we have the most pro-unitary executive court in the history of the Supreme Court. But also, too, I mean, Jen, I think there's probably at least some amount of, I don't know if temporizing is the right word. That was Jack Goldsmith's word. I would say of sort of capital preserving, right? Where I think that the court is worried about the conflicts with the administration in, like, Abrego Garcia, back to where we started, and in the Alien Enemies Act cases. And so, you know, it's very possible at least some of the justices in the majority are telling themselves a story about how by giving Trump wins in these cases, they are further empowering their ability to rule against him in those others. And, you know, maybe as a matter of pure human emotion, I get that. But as a reason to sort of, hand down decisions that you're not going to explain, I have a hard time swallowing that one.
It is such an appropriate kind of horse trading that is not what courts are supposed to be doing. Legislatures, lawmakers, state governments, all kinds of bodies make these kinds of deals. They're compromises. You give me this, I'll give you that one. But in a court of law, it's supposed to be on the merits. And even worse, in this case, even if they wanted to say, fine, we're going to give him some wins, again, it's indulging this emergency action so that all that we get is the Trump administration wins. And that's almost like catering to a PR campaign that Trump has been running, which is the courts are interfering. I get to do what I want. And the court really shouldn't have any part of that. I want to ask a slightly different question. You and I have talked about the failure of Congress to engage with the court, to regulate the court. In a perfect world, could Congress, with the appropriate president, pass legislation to control when emergency petitions will lay with the court? Could they actually require the court to have full hearings to consider these things on the merits?
So there's a lot Congress could do. There are some things I get sort of nervous about. I don't think there's any question, Jen, that Congress could regulate, for example, what the standard of review is in these cases and say, hey, Supreme Court, you can't grant a stay unless certain things are true. The court is already at least supposed to be applying traditional equitable factors for this kind of relief that are reflected in a statute. Congress, I think, could find other ways to sort of require the court to go through its paces in this context. I would get nervous, for example, about a statute that says you have to write an opinion all the time because the court will just, write something perfunctory.
Yeah.
Or, a statute that says you have to disclose the vote count, for example. But certainly there's a lot of space between Congress doing nothing, which is where we are, and where the constitutional line would be. Again, that's if Congress actually thinks this is a problem. And what you said, I think, is so true, which is that it's only a matter of time before we're going to start hearing about how these Supreme Court decisions prove Stephen Miller's critiques of the district judges, right, and vindicate these criticisms of the lower federal courts, which I think is really a sort of a data mismatch, right? Like, even with the 19 emergency applications we've gotten from the Trump administration, Jen, that still leaves over 100 adverse rulings by district courts, right, that aren't being appealed, or at least haven't been appealed to the Supreme Court. And so both things can be true, right? Trump is losing most of these cases, but the ones that the Solicitor General is choosing to bring to the Supreme Court, he's mostly getting what he wants.
Yes.
And splitting that difference requires the kind of nuance that we don't tend to see in a lot of our contemporary discourse about the courts.
And just to catch up our audience, for those of us who are joining, we're talking not only about the really stunning return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but 2 Supreme Court cases decided on this emergency basis, which essentially let the administration keep doing what it has been doing. I think one of the things that is worth looking back on, as you say, the court has been very nervous about really taking Trump on. But in the context in which they finally did, almost, where they said, you've got to make efforts to get people back, or no, you have to give due process consideration, that actually made a difference. Shouldn't this, hello, Chief Justice Roberts, encourage them to stand up, to hold their ground? Because you know what? It works. Trump doesn't completely go over the line, and he had to relent. Shouldn't this buck them up a little bit?
Yes, right? I mean, and this is the problem, right? You're assuming a court that is bothered by the restructuring of the federal government that the Trump administration is in the middle of. And I think we have to increasingly indulge the possibility that part of what's happening in these cases is that the court is nervous about due process. The court wants to preserve a meaningful role for itself and for the federal courts. But when it comes to individual instances of restructuring and reorganization and controversial policy shifts, the court is largely going to be on board with what the Trump administration is doing. And I just hope that we don't look back in 6 months or a year and say that was an enormous mistake and a huge missed opportunity on the court's part. And I hope that, the fact that we have 6 justices who are very strong believers in executive power doesn't end up leading to a series of decisions that rework the separation of powers to such a degree that it actually becomes harder for the courts to do the job that even these justices think it should, right? And so, I don't know that there's as much daylight between the cases in which they are asserting themselves against the Trump administration and the cases in which they are not, as they might themselves think.
Fascinating. Well, one of the lessons I think of this is that we should frankly be extremely skeptical of everything that the government says, even if it's in court,
Yeah.
even if it's government lawyers, even if it's in a declaration. We have seen this pattern. And folks, we're talking about the amazing return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who the government said we couldn't bring back. We have no power. They're in the hands of the El Salvadorans. But we should be extremely skeptical. And frankly, federal court judges who are already skeptical, shouldn't they be extra super careful before they indulge the administration in making claims that later turn out to be not true at all?
I mean, we live in a time, Jen, when there are big lessons multiple times in an hour. And it seems to me that, like, yes, one of the lessons of the denouement and Abrego Garcia is that this government is just not to be trusted. And that includes, lawyers in the Justice Department. And that's a big problem. One of the lessons, though, I think is also a positive one, which is, when the lawyers say, that's not how this works. And when the lawyers say, wait to see what the courts are able to do, a lot of us are going to be impatient because we think, we live in an age of instant gratification. We don't understand why the legal process takes so much time. But there's a difference between the legal process not moving as fast as we want it to and the legal process not being able to produce the effects we want it to produce. And the reality is that, like, in a lot of these cases, the lawsuits are working. Maybe not on the time horizon that we would prefer, maybe not a way we would like, but they're doing what we need them to do insofar as holding the government accountable, and they're protecting at least some of the constitutional rights of some of these folks. The question again, right, is how do we persuade folks, one, that we should be focused on those cases too, and not just the big Supreme Court headlines, but two, how do we persuade the Supreme Court of the same thing?
Well, I think this has been a lesson in many respects today. And I would just caution again, indictments, particularly from this Justice Department,
Yeah.
really have to be taken as nothing more than bare allegations, whether it's Congresswoman McIver, who has been charged with interfering with the officials at the detention center, whether it's Judge Dugan, who was accused and taken away in handcuffs for interfering with ICE, or whether it is really the allegation that suddenly pops up against Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The presumption of innocence has never been more important in the United States. And sadly, it's in large part because you really can't trust these people.
And let me just add one thing to it. I mean, and even if, so let's assume that everything in the indictment is totally above board. And let's assume that they actually are able to persuade, a jury of 12 Tennesseans that, Abrego Garcia is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Fine, right? Like, that is the system working. And so, this was never about, like, Abrego Garcia is an angel who is, immune from any government process. This was always about doing things the right way. And a conviction would be proof of that, not inconsistent with that, right? And that's the point that I think folks need to keep their eyes on the prize here. We don't know what's going to happen in Tennessee, but it almost doesn't matter because the
Yes.
critical part is what has already happened.
Absolutely. And I will just close with this. The reason why we, in part, are so relieved, not only because Trump has been brought to heel, not only because the court system works, but because we ultimately have faith in the American judicial system. This is a place where due process matters. This is a place where he is going to get a trial by his peers if the government even moves forward. This is a place where if something goes awry at trial, he will have the right to appeal. And that's what separates us from these third world countries or second world countries or countries that have been democracy and have backslid into totalitarianism. So a great day, I am sure, great relief for Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Relief for those of us who were insisting that the government could do this, and we were right, and our perennial concern about the Supreme Court, what they're allowing this administration to do. But on balance, I think the rule of law survived to fight another day, and I can't thank you enough, Steve. No one better in the moment to tell us what's going on. And contrarians, you know where to come. When we have breaking news, and it's really breaking news, you can come here. You'll get the best discussion, the best analysis any place. So thank you all. And Steve, have a great weekend. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be
Bye.
with you.